Okay, so welcome to the December 12th, 2025 working group meeting for the Criterion 8 rulemaking process for Act 250. This is really just our third meeting. I think it might be indicated as meeting 4, but we've met twice before, earlier in the fall, and we took a little hiatus as the Land Use Review Board staff and A&R worked on getting some materials together to make another meeting worthwhile. And that's why we're here today. So hopefully everyone remembers each other. Most of you are participating via Teams, so you can scroll down the participant list and see who's here. In the room, it's myself, Alex Weinhagen from the Land Use Review Board, Kirsten Sultan, also from the Land Use Review Board, Peter Tucker from the Vermont Association of Realtors, Jenny Fidel from Audubon, and Bob Zano from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And I want to just say thanks for bearing with us. Our schedule's been elongated a little bit mostly due to work complications for Kirsten and myself. Our board, the Land Use Review Board, is juggling enough right now that having dedicated attention to each item is a little bit challenging at the moment. But in any case, we're back and we've got an agenda to work through. We're in the welcome portion of it. The next item up is to take a look at the general framework for the Criterion 8C rule, and more importantly, have a look at some initial language that A&R has put together to help push the conversation forward. So materials were emailed to all of you. Hopefully you have those accessible. For those in the room, we have some printed materials, but for those of you online, you'll want to refer to those materials. I can share a screen with them as well. So the first item is just the framework, and that document, it's just a one-pager. It's very sketchy. It's just an outline of the sections of the rule that we see coming together, starting with a purpose statement, definitions of various terms, an identification of what constitutes a forest block and a habitat connector with regard to the mapping that we have at the statewide level. And then section 4 would get into the adverse impact. What is an adverse impact and what is an undue adverse impact under the statutory requirements for what we need to address. And this is the bulk of what the A&R proposal that we talked about in our last meeting was talking about. And then the next 3 sections are the sort of meat and potatoes of once a project is deemed to have an undue adverse impact, how do we avoid and minimize that? And if we can't do those things, how do we mitigate? So that's just a rough outline. And again, A&R's draft provides some specificity with regard to some of the definitions, the first few sections. Anybody have comments on the overall outline? Is there like a main section you think we're missing? If not, we'll jump right into A&R's initial language. FYI, I did turn the chat on for this meeting, so if anyone's having trouble hearing or has a question that they want to pose that they're having trouble getting out in an audio form, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, well, if there's no comments on the overall framework, let's dive into the substance. So Bob Zano and Billy Coster collaborated on some language that they've been talking to Kirsten and I about, and that's what this draft A&R Criterion 8C guideline document is. It's very rough. It's just an initial draft. And it's meant to address the first 4 sections of, the first 4 sections of the framework, without really getting into the purpose section, which would be added to this. So there's a few definitions on the first page. And then there's text to help everyone understand what A&R's proposal was last time. Bob, do you want to say anything about this, or do you want me to just rattle on through it?
Maybe you should keep going and then we'll circle back.
Yeah. So the idea here is that we're acknowledging what a forest block and a habitat connector are per the statutory definitions. But then we're going ahead and we're saying these areas have been mapped by Vermont Fish and Wildlife through Vermont Conservation Design. And we are going to rely on that mapping to know what a forest block is or where it is on the landscape. But we're going to acknowledge that because that's a remote sensing product, there are inherent errors in it. And so it has to be coupled with on the ground information about what the true extent of forest block is. And I think we talked about this last time. The current forest block mapping that Fish and Wildlife has done misses early successional forests. So if there was a recent timber harvest, you're going to see a squiggly line in the middle of what looks like should be a continuous forest block, which looks like there's an excluded portion, which in many cases is not and should not be excluded. It's just a different stage of forest succession. So it's the combination of the maps together with actual aerial photography and on the ground know-how to be clear about the extent of forest blocks. But the maps will get us most of the way there. That's page 1 and 2. On the bottom of page 2 of the document, we walk into direct impacts and where there's going to be an impact. Reminder that this forest block mapping that was part of Vermont Conservation Design is limited to forest blocks of 20 acres or more in size. So little copse of trees in your backyard is not going to show up as a forest block in this mapping. So under the adverse impacts, this is more of a conversation piece at this point, explaining sort of what the different aspects of direct impacts are and how we might measure them in terms of the actual aerial extent of the forest block being impacted, the linear measure of new edge that's created, edge being the end of the forest block where it meets up with development, and the change in the number of forest blocks. So if a development is actually fragmenting a forest block into multiple smaller blocks, we want to be able to measure that too, to understand what the direct impacts are. And then there's a section on indirect impacts that addresses the fact that as you develop a forest block, the core areas of that forest, so the areas that are more than 300 feet from the edge, are that sort of reach of that impact reaches into the forest block more as you eat away at the edges of it. You push that indirect impact further into the block. So those are some of the types of impacts and a little bit on some of the metrics we might use. Any questions about that? This section, I think, is table setting for where we will go with minimization techniques. Like we need to understand how we might measure impacts to then be able to look at minimization techniques and be able to measure them and come up with maybe some bright lines. Go ahead, Chris.
The only thing I would suggest, to the extent that this is going to be for public consumption eventually, is just share like an example of a current analog to this process. About starting with like a remote sensed map and then having the applicant have to ground truth it. Just because you may have people looking at this who've never done anything like this before.
Yes, for sure. You're looking at words on a page, and pictures are going to be way more effective to get across the concept. So Kirsten and I anticipate that we will have 2 documents in the end. One will be the rule. One will be the guidance document that helps interpret the rule. it's more likely that the guidance document will be full of pretty pictures. The rule may be a little more dry and esoteric, but we'll see as we go how the interplay of those two documents will work out. Peter, did you have a question?
Well, just quick, yeah. In the forest block definition, first page, or other natural habitat, what is that? What do you envision other natural habitat to be? I don't know, Bob.
Yeah, I thought I was trying to clarify something that I think is already in there, but is written a little strange, that it says a forest block may include features including recreational trails, wetlands, and other natural features that do not themselves possess tree cover. When we've mapped forest blocks at Fish and Wildlife, we include things like beaver wetlands, the alpine top
Makes
of
sense,
Camel's
yeah.
Hump. And so this was just an attempt to make that a little clearer, that those things.
Gotcha. So that's referring to those areas,
Yep.
recreational trails, wetlands.
Well, not the trails, but the wetlands and other natural features. Just
Okay.
kind of restating it to hopefully be more clear.
Thank you.
Charlie, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. Just a quick clarification. Under indirect impacts, it talks about the 300-foot extension into the forest block, thinking about the impacts there. And then later in the document, on the next page, there's a line about or occur within XXX feet of a forest block mapped by Fish and Wildlife. And I was just, that made me think, would the 300 feet impact be applied to development which occurs adjacent to a forest block? So if development occurs on open land right up against the forest block, is that going to trigger this criteria because of the 300-foot extent into the block?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think the way this current draft is worded, if folks want to turn to page 4, which presents sort of a stepwise process for knowing, whether you have to address this criteria. It does have that XXX feet of a forest block, which I think, yeah, makes my mind go to the same question. In conversations with Billy and Bob just the other day, it's not the intent that development in non-forest blocks would trigger an impact to the forest block. So to answer your question succinctly, the answer is no. So Bob, do you want to explain what you were getting at with that XXX feet of a forest block? Because it does, when you work the stepwise process, it does sort of confuse me too as to whether if you're out of the block but near it, you're suddenly going to be in this criteria.
Yeah, maybe just, since we haven't really gotten to that section, going back to this idea of the 300-foot indirect, I think the thinking that we were putting forward is that if you're outside of a forest block, you're at the edge of a forest block. There's already 300 feet of that forest block that experience some level of indirect impacts. And so not to be accounting projects that are outside of the forest block, they're not really creating new edge. They're not adding really substantial new indirect impacts, so that wouldn't be a consideration later on when this all plays out. The next piece in that flow chart thing, my thinking there was mostly just to provide some buffer distance so that people don't get caught off guard if what's on the ground is slightly different than the map. It's a totally different concept in play there, just to make people look like, oh, I'm not right at the edge, but I'm close, and maybe I should just be aware that there's the potential that the map is not totally right.
Yeah, so I think, so Charlie, you understand the intent then, right? It's not to require the criteria of work outside the block.
Yeah, I get the intent, and I think I agree with what Bob's saying. I think just as we refine the document more, that was just one area that I saw as a potential point of confusion. But thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking, because I had the exact same question when we looked at this recently together internally.
Yeah, so I did jump the gun a little bit. So page 3 is where it jumps into presumptions of potential undue adverse impacts. And this, we've already talked about this, right? At the last meeting, A&R made a pitch to say, let's reduce the universe, since there's a lot of forest blocks in the state of Vermont. And let's focus and assume that undue adverse impacts would be present only if the highest priority forest blocks, as mapped by Vermont Conservation Design, are impacted. Not any old piece of forest, but just the highest priority. So that's what this section on page 3 and 4 just reiterates, that same proposal from before. But then I think what Bob's done is helpful with regard to the stepwise process. And I would love to just hear people's thoughts about whether they understand it, because Charlie's comment was a good one. And I wonder if there are other questions about how this stepwise process looks to you. Go ahead, Dory.
Hi, thanks. I guess the question that comes up for me, and I think a lot of you know that I come from a wetlands background where we do delineations with a certain level of accuracy. And I'm looking at the first step in terms of how many feet away are you from a forest block, and just wondering how that, what is the expectation that we're using for, this resource, right out of the gate? What are people supposed to be using to, I guess, in my most common vernacular, delineate the edge of the forest block?
I think the VCD maps is the starting place, right?
Right, but we're saying you need to go, on the ground as part of this and not just rely on those maps. That's what I thought we were talking about previously.
Yeah, and Bob, feel free to tell me to stop talking, but I think the intent just with this X feet away is just to put people on notice that if you're within some proximity of a mapped forest block, this is an issue you need to be looking at more carefully.
So it's really in step 2, Dory. Step 2 is where you address. So it sounds like we have a little bit of an echo going on. I'm not sure why.
Online.
Anyways, in step 2, you decide whether or not the project does in fact intersect with those highest priority areas. I'm guessing, Bob, that that's where you would make the determination based on aerial photo interpretation, on the ground knowledge. Yes? Or is that step 1?
Yeah, I guess if I understand what you're saying, Dory, there's like 2 things at play. One is just figuring out whether you're broadly, whether you're in the block or not. The other is to what level of precision do these block edges get actually determined on the ground? And I think this XX feet is, like Billy said, meant to put people on notice to check to make sure the edge is right. But where that precision is a different question.
So maybe there does need to be another step in this stepwise process, which is simply to verify that the project is in fact in a forest block with aerial photo interpretation and on the ground knowledge. But perhaps that's part of step 1. Honestly, Bob, as I looked at the example that we're going to work through later in the meeting, the only area that really matters for is when you have a forest block that has one of these early successional carve outs in it. And you wouldn't want someone to say, I'm in that area, therefore I don't need to worry about this criteria. You want them to think through that. But if it's not one of those, if it's merely the edge of the block, seems fairly straightforward. And I'm thinking that the de minimis sorts of impacts on the very edge are going to be such that it may not matter. Like if you're 25 feet on either side of wherever it's deemed to be the edge. But
You have a question online, Dan Malik.
oh yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I'm sorry, I muted you, but
That's fine. I think, Alex, you might have just answered it with that de minimis 25 feet if we can establish something firm. But perhaps I'm jumping then to 4B. how would that individual from Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department determine whether it's a tree trunk or the edge of the canopy from which we're measuring that distance? And that canopy could spread 30, 40, 50 feet. And it would be nice as soon as possible for a property owner or their design professional to know what those numbers are, because often choices can be made. The sooner the better. Thank you.
I love that question because again, I had the same one, and I think there can be lots of different delineation and interpretation of tree line, you know, in the field, on site plans. And I think this is where we could have some simple illustrations. But
Yeah, that's a question I've heard from others as
Yeah.
well, and we'll need to be clear about it. And just so everyone in the room is clear, or everybody in this meeting is clear, Bobby, correct me if I'm wrong. The forest block mapping in Vermont Conservation Design comes from LiDAR data, which is where you send a light pulse down, and it bounces off tree canopies and the ground. And hold on here just a moment. There we go. And the reflection of that tells you where the forest is and its canopy. That's my point, is that it is the canopy that is what these maps are based on. It is not the tree trunk. So we have to keep that in mind, that that's what the data set is. And then from a policy standpoint and a practicality standpoint, we need to, in these rules and guidance, clarify what we mean by that, and whether we're taking it as canopy or we're gonna use on the ground knowledge to move it back to the trunk of the tree as the edge.
maybe something in between.
Right. Okay, well, just to walk through the stepwise process real quick, you know, the first step is to decide whether the project intersects with the mapped forest block area. And again, Bob's point is that if we add this or within a certain number of feet, it's not to trigger the need to meet the criteria necessarily. It's to trigger the need to look more closely to make sure that the mapping is not in error. So if the answer is no, you're not off the hook, right? Because there's two different resources that this criteria is interested in. One is forest blocks. The other are habitat connectors. And so if the answer is no, then we go to step 4. Bob, I'm going to need your help and just sort
Yeah, I
of
was wondering if Bob might
making
want to
this
give a-
work the right way, so I don't take us afield there.
Sure. So the idea here is step 1. This is like from the very basic stuff, right? So step 1 is just, is there a forest block near your project? Any forest block, right? Of the 4,000 some that there are. If no, then you're totally in the clear. Well, not totally in the clear, but you skip right ahead to step 4. If yes, then the question is it highest priority? Because that gets to the proposal A&R made about the presumption around highest priority forest blocks. If your highest priority for any of those 3 functions, you'd have to address the fragmentation piece of the criterion. So that's what step 2 is doing. Then step 3 is about, are you also in an area that is providing this highest priority connectivity function, in which case you'd have to address the connectivity portion of the criterion. And what I was thinking with step 4 was basically, because this is set up as sort of presumptions, but not necessarily 100% the case that something out of these highest priority blocks could never raise a concern. 4 is kind of like a flag that, is there anything else going on that could potentially flag that this could come up as an issue, and it's better for people to be aware of that and figure out whether there's any concern there or not. And so just, that's a flag maybe you want to consult with the department and just get our take on that. You know, because town plans, Other conservation groups can put out other information. They can prioritize connectivity in other ways. And so just if there's other data out there, just trying to provide a way for that to fit in and for people to understand.
But number 4 then, because I got turned around, that's why I asked you to step in. Number 4 is really not related to Criterion 8C, right? If you get to number 4, you're out of Criterion 8C, and this is a heads up about potential other review processes or at the town level or within the state.
I mean, I hope that this is sort of like an oddball thing that maybe is not critical, and I don't want to get sidetracked on it. But the idea is that that we've set up a process with the A&R proposal on somewhere further back on page 2, that there's this rebuttable presumption of the highest priority blocks being the area of concern. And so what step 4 is doing, it's just trying to raise the flag that, hey, it's possible that there's this other information out there that someone might want to rebut this presumption in these cases. You might want to check with A&R to see, like, is that likely, or is A&R going to have concerns too, or is it just going to be a non-issue? It's trying to help people, not make it more complex. I don't know, Billy, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, in hindsight, it may be easier to take that out of this section and have like a standalone section that addresses like how to rebut that presumption. Because I do think this is a little confusing. It's basically like 3 says you're done, then this is like another step. So it may be just that, there's a separate section that talks about, the burden of proof and production, persuasion and production necessary to rebut that presumption. And this could be some of the information that's included therein.
It could be an
And that would-
optional
that
step,
would
like a recommend.
That would simplify the actual flow of the review under the criteria.
Go ahead, Jamie.
So so number 4 would apply if you're not in a high priority block. This would just be the rebuttable presumption if you're in one of the other blocks or in a connectivity area. And am I reading this right, that you're kind of making the assumption that the connectivity area would be within a forest block? So it's not necessary to kind of look at them separately. You would kind of first determine, are you in a high priority forest block, and then understand that there's a connectivity function
Right.
for delineation there, but there wouldn't be cases where there'd be a separate connectivity. There wouldn't be another high priority. There wouldn't be a connectivity area that would not be included in a high priority forest block.
Yeah, I think so far the thinking here is focusing on the highest priority connectivity blocks as the places for applying the criterion.
And that would be captured through first doing a forest block analysis. Or it may.
Yes, the highest priority connectivity blocks are forest blocks. They are a subset of them.
Okay.
So if you're in the universe of highest priority, you could be a connectivity block, but you might not be. You might be just a regular piece of forest that doesn't need to, or we don't need to factor in a connectivity function. But it could be a particular type of forest block where we do need to factor that in.
I guess the only question I have there, and I need to look at the definitions a little bit more, but did Act 181 contemplate that all habitat connectivity areas would be nested within a forest block, or are there other potentially important connectivity areas? Well, I guess I'm thinking like riparian areas. Are there other high priority or connectivity areas that should be considered that are not in forest blocks? Would that be covered under 4?
That wasn't my thinking around 4. I think part of the challenge is we did map what we called riparian corridors. It's any vegetation in a riparian zone, a broad riparian zone. So we don't have this highest priority filter in quite the same way to put on it. And so just kind of set it aside for the flow chart for right now.
So, but I think just to answer your question, yes, riparian corridors are important habitat connectors. period. And the forest block mapping does not map all of them. So we have to decide whether to include them. And Vermont Conservation Design does map them. This is what Bob was saying. But the mapping of those riparian corridors is so large that it's not useful for this purpose. So how we would take riparian corridors and select just the subset that would be a rebuttable presumption of for this under this criterion, we don't know how to do that. So if anybody else has a suggestion on how to do that, or that we need to work harder to figure that out, this is a good time to pick that up and say that. But right now, this model does not include riparian corridors because we haven't figured out a way to select the most important subset of them.
Or it's just another way of looking at that 4 is the placeholder for that right now, and then we need to decide, is there a subset that would
No.
function?
No, 4 is solely about whether something is not a highest priority block and whether the presumption that it doesn't fall under 8C should be rebutted or not. Our recommendation is not to address riparian areas under this explicitly because we don't have good mapping, and there's already 2 or 3 other criteria that address impacts to riparian areas. I think if folks want to do that, certainly we can talk about it, but I just want to be clear. 4 is just about if people want to rebut the presumption that blocks that are mapped that are not highest priority don't fall under 8C. Sorry, there's a lot of double negatives in there.
I think this is a really important point, so I'd like to hover on it for just a little bit, even though we're over time. So Annette, do you have, I don't want to ignore you. What do you have?
So I like Billy's suggestion of separating this out into a separate section of rebuttable presumption. And I'm understanding that this would allow people in a community to point out that a parcel that's under 20 acres, for instance, has important connectivity or habit and so that would be able to be rebutted and would be considered part of 8C. Alex, you said a little earlier that you said that 4 would mean it wasn't part of 8C, but the way I'm understanding it, it would be, and that it would allow for areas that are not mapped as high priority forest blocks to bring in community knowledge. Okay, does that make sense?
It sure does, Annette. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I got myself turned around there. That's why I gave it over to Bob. But I think Bob and Billy have explained better what it is, and I agree. A separate section seems to be a good place.
So Jean put a message in the chat and she also has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
Thank you. I think my question is, I don't really understand this question 4, and maybe it's because I don't really understand what rebuttable presumption means. But I think what would help me understand is how is somebody encountering, so basically the regional coordinator would be talking someone through these questions, and then they would, like, how does a landowner encounter these questions?
Right, so there would be a guidance document that would include this stepwise list that would direct the landowner or whoever they're working with to walk through the steps. And to the extent that they have questions about, I'm not sure what that step means, or I'd like to just double check and make sure that I'm doing this correctly, they would reach out to our district coordinator who would then help them, yes. And
Okay,
consultation with Vermont Fish and Wildlife is also part of this, but we're hoping that for most projects, it can be relatively straightforward for a landowner together with a district coordinator to work this through on their own.
Got it.
And Jean,
Yeah,
you
and just-
had a question in the chat about why the 20 acres, right? Where that was. So that's a function of the sort of minimum mapping resolution that the Vermont Conservation Design mapping of forests did. Bob, do you have anything to say about why 20 acres was the minimum sort of resolution that was used?
I think just 20 acres is a reasonable cutoff for a point at which you're talking about a group of trees rather than really a fully functioning forest.
And I I think for everyone's benefit, it would be helpful just to do like a little rewind on VCD, right? So Vermont Conservation Design identified over 4,000 forest blocks that were 20 acres or greater, right? We had to have a minimum number, so identified over 4,000 of them. Of that 4,000+, about what, like 1,500 were identified as highest priority. It's unlikely that many of those are as small as 20 acres. Most of them are probably going to be bigger. There may be some rare instances that small ones are highest priority. What we're proposing is that this criteria only applies to that subset, that 1,500 or so highest priority forest blocks as the starting place. And what number 4 does is say, if other people feel like there are blocks within that 4,000 or anywhere that aren't identified as highest priority, but have really unique features that we didn't know about, there's a process for them to come forward and make that argument to the district commission. But the presumption is that those are not significant and do not get regulated under this criteria. So that's kind of the frame that we're trying to work with.
I think if I can just add to that, Billy, it's the idea here is also not to just to assist people in figuring out how to identify other places, but to make sure that people doing projects don't get caught off guard by something that other people are aware of.
Right.
And it could be as simple as you contact Fish and Wildlife, and Fish and Wildlife says, yeah, that was identified as a regional priority. It's not something we think is going to cause undue problems in 8C. And so you should be, from our perspective, there's no concern.
Go ahead, Jean. Do you still have a question, follow-up?
I do. Thank you. Thank you, Billy. That was a very helpful translation. And I have to beg your forgiveness, everyone, because this is not this is a stretch for me in terms of my understanding and ability to think about land use policy. But what is frequently missing from the conversation for me, and Billy, your like grounding into the numbers there was very helpful. What I'm missing is like, okay, so how many of those parcels are potentially or are in reality owned by low-income landowners? And what is the economic impact going to be for them to now have to go through this regulation as well? And it's not to like pick on this criterion specifically. It's kind of across the whole Act 250 board. If somebody has already thought that through, like, okay, well, this is what it means for, in this part of Vermont, there's sort of this cluster because of the overlapping features of there's a low income neighborhood that is like coming up against the significant, highly valuable forest block, highest priority forest block. And because of this criterion, they're now going to what? Like, have to do, like, if their child wants to build a house, they want to subdivide, and there's not really a viable mitigation plan, is that going to create a scenario where their child cannot live on their family land? And how many people is that going to happen for? And so, and again, please forgiveness if what I'm saying is like totally off base, because I may be missing something, but that's the analysis that I would love to do with somebody, ideally this whole group. Thank you.
I guess just a quick thank you for raising that, Gene, and just a quick response. I think that like 1,500 or so highest priority blocks that we're discussing that this criteria specifically address, those are certainly mapped. So we could work with you or whomever to kind of superimpose them on like EJ communities or other things if that was helpful, or just to give you a general sense of where they are. I think the other thing is, as you'll see as we go deeper into this, in a lot of cases, the approach is just going to, is that some level of development, especially something like a single family home, is likely going to be compatible with these areas. There may need to be conversations around kind of the location or kind of minimizing the overall footprint of some of that stuff in some really key areas, but it's probably in most cases not going to prevent some limited amount of development from occurring. There may be cases where that's not true, but I think overwhelmingly for kind of small scale, like a house for someone's kid, this criteria is likely not going to kind of prevent that from happening. I don't know, Bob, do you think that's a fair assessment? Again, there may be some specific, really critical pinch points in the landscape where that's not true, but I think largely speaking, those sorts of activities should be compatible.
Yeah, and I just want to say, because we're gonna run out of time here if we spend all of our time on just this first item, but Gene, your point is a really important one. But to be able to do some of that analysis, we have to have a draft. We have to have some sort of idea of where the criterion is going. Then we can analyze impacts and those sorts of things. And so I want us to do that, but I also want us to get through the basics first, of just like where are the areas we're looking at, what ecologically, where do we stand? Okay, so Peter, did you have a question?
Well, just quickly, it seems to me like 8C would apply to an Act 250 permit applicant, right? Which would be, somebody that's doing a subdivision greater than 10 units, and could apply to tier 2 or tier 3, I think.
Yeah.
So if you're not kicking an Act 250 permit, 8C isn't going to apply. Like I'm thinking the single family home, analysis. And then as far as highest priority, I'm looking at the map and the orange area on the map. And are those the highest priority, or are those all the forest mapping?
I don't have the map up. If it's orange, it's likely the highest priority connectivity blocks.
This is the highest priority and others, so I didn't know what other was. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, we have some comments. Charlie, you're first.
Just a clarifying question related to the 20-acre conversation as it relates to direct impacts. This talks about creating fragments less than 20 acres. And if so, those 20 acres are deemed to have an impact. I can't find the direct language, but what's the thought around fragments which are connected by hedgerows, something like that? And I know there's like edge criteria that gets used as well, but if the 20-acre threshold is related to whether or not the forested area of that 20 acres is having a direct impact counted towards the impacted acreage, my brain just goes towards creative land conversion that maintains a quote forested connection when it's not really a functional connection. How could that be considered here?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet, Charlie. We need to think about what the minimization strategies would be, and to what extent those are gaming the system versus actually encouraging proper development design. But I will tell you that if you look at the forest block mapping, some of the forest blocks are squirrely in that way. They're not just one big blob. They're all over the map. And the example we're going to work through, you'll see that, at least one of the examples. So
understood. I think I was looking more at where it gets at the creation of new forest blocks that are less than 20 acres, because the way it's written is that then is saying that those fragments shall be considered as areas of direct impact. And we can parking lot that question until some other time if we want to keep moving now.
It's a good thing for everyone's edification to understand the way that the A&R language reads. If there's, just to keep it simple, if you have 100-acre block, okay, and your development is dividing it into 3 15-acre blocks and the rest of it's developed, those 3 15-acre blocks will still be forest and will still look like forest, but they won't function like a forest block anymore. And this language says if the development is fragmenting and the leftover patches are less than 20 acres, each patch individually, then we're going to count that entire area as developed, even if it's a 15-acre tract of woods. That's what it's trying to get at.
We're gonna count it as impact, not developed.
Sorry, right, impact.
Yeah, understood. And so I guess the thing I was seeing is somebody seeing that and saying, well, we're going to maintain a hedgerow between that and the newly created fragment, thereby making it connected, quote unquote. And therefore that 15-acre block is actually not subject to the direct impact quantification that we're talking about.
I got you. Yeah. Let's parking lot that
Okay.
concern. Yes, sort of spaghetti, not spaghetti lots, but spaghetti forest blocks to get around this 20-acre issue. Kirsten?
I just wanted you to know the room camera doesn't pick you up at all, just so you know.
That's to everyone's benefit. Okay, so we do need to put a wrap on this section, but I feel like it's pretty substantive. So we kind of made our way through the steps. Bob was, and trying to explain, and I was doing a poor job of explaining that it's asking whether you're in a forest block area that is of highest priority. Therefore, there's a presumption that there is an impact. And then it's asking you, is it just the forest block criteria that you need to address, or is it both that and the habitat connectivity that you have to address? Do folks understand the difference between the two? Not in terms of what we're recommending, but just the fact that there are two different spheres that need to be addressed: forest blocks versus habitat connectors. Okay, I see thumbs up. Jamie, go ahead.
Just a quick thing. I do understand it from the perspective of what's proposed. I guess where I'm still a little fuzzy, and I guess I would just make this recommendation that when the rebuttable presumption gets fleshed out, that there be the ability to consider important habitat connectivity areas that may not be showing up in that forest block. Because as I read the definition, it could include other features. And I think it's fair to make it a rebuttable presumption and not have it be automatic that the applicant has to deal with that. But it does seem like there should be a catch-all opportunity there to look at important areas.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, you'll notice that this initial part of the drafting, leaves out all the fun stuff, which is, once you've been declared as having an impact, how do you avoid, minimize, or mitigate it? And that's because we just haven't written it yet. We're getting there, but so rather than try to write it with a groupthink, my thought was that we would look at some illustrations to get an idea of what this conservation subdivision or conservation design topic that we talked about last time means on the ground. So let's do that. Talk a little bit about if you have thoughts that are tumbling out of those pictures. And maybe I will share my screen for this portion so that we can be looking at the same picture at the same time. But these were sent along with the email, so feel free to pull them up elsewhere on your screen if you have room. And I will share. And just know that it's a little hard for me to see all of you with my screen share. So Kirsten, help me if someone raises a hand, or if you're not being called on, just speak up. So this concept of conservation subdivision goes by a bunch of different names. That's one of them. Conservation design is another. Clustering, natural resource protection zoning, open space design. And my hope is that by looking at these illustrations, maybe we can think about some key design differences between conventional and conservation types of development, and what common themes might be. So this is the most rudimentary image. The first one shows you the existing landscape on the left. And then it shows you what a typical or conventional subdivision might look like, which, you know, is looking to keep homes as far apart as possible and tries to utilize, you know, most of the site. And then on the far right, we have, you know, what would be a conservation neighborhood where where the homes and the impacts are focused in areas that have the least impact. So we're not crossing that riparian corridor. We're trying to keep as much of the forested area intact. We are, in this case, also looking to put the development on the forest field interface so as to keep that presumably agricultural field available for agricultural use going forward. Same number of homes, but less impacts. These are a little more specific with prettier illustrations. So here's an existing parcel, predominantly forested. There's a road on the sort of upper portion of the image with a few houses along it and some agricultural land here. But we've got mostly undeveloped forest with a riparian area working through the bottom here. This shows what a conventional subdivision might look like, trying to maximize the development potential. And it's full conversion for the most part, right? It's punching a road in and trying to orient homes along that road, sort of double loading along the road with home sites. And as a result, the ability to manage forests is essentially lost. Hey, look, they did a decent job of staying away from the stream area, but in terms of a forest block, the forest block is largely removed. And to the example that we were talking about per Charlie's comments, you'll see in the middle of this neighborhood, there's a little patch of forest, right? And the idea is like, yeah, that's woods. But if in this draft that A&R came up with, if that patch of woods is less than 20 acres, it's not really functioning as a forest block anymore. So we want to consider that to be impacted in the same way that all of these mowed grass lawns are as well. You'll notice that, you know, there's a lot of driveway and road infrastructure, so the development costs are high. In a scenario like this, especially in Vermont, the cost of the homes is necessarily going to be high to pay for all that infrastructure. This is the conservation subdivision version of that same development with a similar number of homes, focused on closer to the existing road network and smaller lots, more clustering, still strategic use of trees and landscaping to provide privacy, but far less impact, far more intact forest block as a result. Edge effects are also much more focused and minimized. In the prior example, everything is an edge, right? Everything is, there's an edge between forest and yard space pretty much around the entire parcel after it's been developed. Here, there's plenty of edges within the developed footprint, but then there's one edge along the forest, sort of remaining forest and home site, and that's it. And there's much more core forest in the middle that has not had that indirect edge impact. Here's another example. This is a conventional subdivision, again, in a primarily wooded area. This just shows you, you know, full utilization of the parcel with a circular road, lots of home sites. Here's an idea of what conservation subdivision could look like, which maintains as much interior forest as practical, reducing that amount of penetration into the forest, and also reducing the infrastructure costs, hopefully making the costs less. Here's a smaller scale example of just, you know, a 4-lot subdivision with sort of a conventional design where all of the road frontage is utilized, separate driveways for each house site. And what could happen if it were designed with a clustered footprint, so that you have a larger forest area remaining you have about the same linear distance away from the road that is being impacted into the forest, this last house at the end of the road. But because it's clustered and focused, you have far less overall incursion into the forest and much more remaining. This is not rocket science, but I think when I look at these pictures, I start to get ideas about what kinds of minimization strategies we could be talking about in those sections of the rule in terms of minimizing edge, minimizing penetration into the interior forest, and the like. Here's one more example of sort of a conventional use all the road frontage, maybe meet a conventional zoning dimensional standard for that. And the same amount of development, but all of that development focused on one side of the parcel with a common road, shared infrastructure, still private lots, but along a shared road, leaving about a third to a half of the property in a forest condition. This, to my mind, this is an example of where if you had a habitat connector, and perhaps it was here on this side of the property, that you could demonstrate that you were minimizing your impact on that habitat connector by showing that there's still a reasonable amount of habitat or forest to make that connectivity possible, unlike this example where that's lost. And so just a couple of additional considerations. We talked a bit about core forest, and the ANR's suggestion was to use this 300-foot indirect impact. And that differentiates between the interior forest and the areas that are closer to the edges that have greater wind impacts, sunlight, predation or nest parasitism, and other sorts of edge effects that come with being closer to an edge as opposed to in the core of the forest. Important for certain species. And then finally, this image down below, both of these come from a South Carolina publication that Kirsten found that has some pretty good information in it. And this bottom illustration is just showing context matters. And if you have development on separate properties over time, and you have a resource running through all of them, being able to look at that resource beyond the parcel boundaries so that as each parcel comes in for development, you could try to connect those blocks, connect those forest blocks or habitat connectors so they work over time.
So Alex, there's a question in the chat from Jean. Can I read it?
Yes.
Do you anticipate road rule disincentivizing clustered development? That's the question from Jean. Oh, Chris has offered a reply, suspecting it will be the opposite. I agree with Chris.
Right. The idea behind the road rule is that it requires permitting if you're building a long road. If you're clustering with less road, then you may be able to avoid the need for an Act 250 permit. And so the road rule is really designed to try to encourage clustering and reduce the amount of infrastructure being built. Should help drive down the costs of that development and hopefully the cost of the ultimate housing. But it's also designed to try to address these issues that you see in that you saw in these illustrations. So
got it. So can I ask a follow-up? Because is it like the length of contiguous road, or is it the total road built in a development? So in the example where you have multiple connections to the front road, is the road rule triggered by the cumulative of all of those driveways, or is it by each individual, that none of them exceed 800 feet?
That's a good question. No, the way the statute's written, it is the cumulative amount. So yes, if you had a clustered design that still had a lot of road in it, you might be tripping the road rule and be in jurisdiction. So I wanted to show those pictures just to get your brain turning a little bit and see if people had thoughts. So were there common design elements embodied in those that you think we could reference or use in the minimization strategies of the rule? Any thoughts? Any light bulbs?
I'll start.
Peter.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
So, yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, as far as minimizing impacts, right, that's exactly what you're trying to show here. So, you know, to that extent, that is, you know, when you think about minimization, I think your examples are kind of the perfect way to look at it. So, and then how do you mitigate if you can't minimize and,
Right.
you know, or is this just avoidance? I mean, you know, certainly you're creating better forested areas. So I guess, you know, in terms of avoiding, you know, you can kind of look at it from that perspective as well.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when we first talked about this at the last meeting or meeting before last, I mean, this is exactly what I had in mind. And were these the slides from NECAPA?
Yes.
Okay.
Several of the illustrations were from that presentation you provided.
Awesome. Because the reason I was asking, I was sitting so far away from them in that room, I couldn't recognize the detail. But the other thing too that we can, again, as we flesh this out, like in a user guide or an explanation to the legislature or whoever, we can also talk about like precedent, like where these things have actually been built. And another real benefit of these to me, there, of course, how you structure the land tenure, land ownership of especially that common land can vary greatly, right? It could be one of those properties, like especially if it's the original farm or forest owner, they may want to retain all of it. But in other cases, right, that kind of winds up going into like part of a homeowners association or in some cases you could even do a public easement. And so there are other, I know this isn't for the LURB to necessarily get into, but there are other ways we can think about this, like to um, incentivize the cluster design, especially, and again, I'm not trying to open up a can of worms, but you know, if you know, just under the Vermont rubric, right, where you know, basically, if you don't post your land, it's generally assumed that the public can access it. You know, that might also make these kinds of developments more favorable to hikers, hunters, fishermen, you know, a wide array of people. So I guess where I'm going with this is that this might actually be in keeping with kind of the overall traditional Vermont land use ethic. But just wanted to put that out there, kind of on the softer side of this stuff.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else have thoughts about some of what the illustrations were showing or concerns about, you know, what those illustrations were showing? Go ahead, Annette.
Yeah, I'll just acknowledge that it was around 2003. I did interviews with people all around the state about the issues they had with Act 250, and one of them involved a housing development in Chittenden County. And exactly what you just described was the result of the citizen participation. So it has already worked. I've seen at least one example of it where, because the public got involved, a project that was designed exactly as the first one you showed got changed into exactly what you showed it could be changed into. So I just want to acknowledge the value of Act 250 and the value of public participation in getting these things to happen.
Thanks, Annette. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to second Chris's notion that actual examples of where this has also been effective could be offered for people to visit. And along those lines, emphasizing that the same number of units or lots have been achieved on both sets of plans is important. And perhaps along with that, some numbers about the lot sizes. Maybe you've gone from 10 to 2 or 3, and that 2 or 3 is still a comfortable lot size for a lot of builders based on their price point need and their hopeful return on investment. So the final version of this perhaps could estimate, I know they're just illustrations, the relative lot sizes that have been achieved, the relative length of roadway, which would translate into infrastructure costs. But wonderful illustrations, really beautiful and evocative.
All right, I got notes on those suggestions. Thanks, Dan. Josh?
Yeah, I was just gonna echo that. I think the larger lots that you show, which are developed, there'd be a developer involved and it's better use of space, and agree that that is a better approach and meets the multiple goals here. I think the examples that had like just the 4 units might be a little fantasy. Those wouldn't individually trigger Act 250, and people tend to have 5-10 acres, depending, especially if it's in a rural zone, and they're individually going to build their home by themselves. It's not a development in many senses. And so that's just, I don't think going to be the reality, in those sort of cases. So I don't know what to do about those. And if they're in a tier 3 where that's the only trigger for Act 250 is the number of units, maybe along a tier 3 area where it's a habitat connector along the road, that may be a different outcome on those sub Act 250 developments, which are one person's property building one lot along these roads. I disagree that that's sort of an approach that can be achieved with what we're laying out here. But above 10 units, yes, and it's a better design and better use of the property.
Great, Josh. Thanks for that. I do agree that if to the extent we're going to have illustrations and to bring this out to the public and then eventually be in the rule or guidance, we need to have one for just a single lot and development on a single lot, and what that would look like in terms of highly consumptive and impactful development versus a development that has minimized its impact under this criteria when it's just a single house. Tier 3 is the good example. I agree. Like that's going to trigger the need for Act 250 permits for smaller scale developments that have never had to go through Act 250 before, or for the most part have not had to. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you. Other thoughts or light bulbs regarding what you saw in the pictures? Aside from the fact that they're pretty. Jamie.
I think they're super helpful. And I can think of a couple of, like, I was curious, like what's the acreage of some of these? So I don't know if it would be helpful to almost give an example, because where you're keeping that forest land and if you're allowing it to, let's say, be enrolled in current use versus not, that's another like important, consideration. The other thing is that when I worked at VNRC and we did a lot of exercises with realtors and engineers on sort of a series of how to design with fragmentation in mind, one of the big benefits that they often mention when they were doing clustering is people really like to have a shared resource like a forest land parcel. And while that's not required through the criteria, it could be beneficial to say on the map that remaining forest land could actually be used in common. So it's just a couple other thoughts you could weave into the illustrations that I think further underscore the benefit of doing some of the design that way.
Yeah, I do think that at least in our education about this, outlining what happens with that large block of retained forest is important, because in my work at the town level, I would frequently talk to folks who would say, I would show them pictures like this and they would say, who's going to manage that? What's it going to happen to that? That's just going to, nothing's going to be done on that leftover land. And I would have to explain, well, no, the intent is to have it large enough so that it would be affordable, because it could be enrolled in current use, that it could have continued forest management, maybe for sugaring. There's all sorts of things that could happen, or recreational use by the neighborhood or the community, what have you. There are options, but I think, oftentimes folks' first thought is that's just going to be leftover land. It won't be very productive. You should just do it a different way. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Kirsten.
So do people think that we need illustrations for different types of development activity? I know Warren's mentioned ski area, but like a utility corridor, commercial park, or the examples that have been shown are really focused around, residential subdivision activity. I see someone giving a thumbs up, Chris.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think to the extent you have the capacity to do that, I think it would be awesome. Just because there's so many people, right, who are thinking about this and like the absolute worst, right, this is the apocalypse, it's the end of development in Vermont. But other people might also have alternatively kind of have some utopian vision about it. But I think the more that we can do things visually rather than just trying to use words would be helpful. And this might be something that could quickly be done. I mean, yeah, I don't know what kind of resources you have. If you got a landscape architect on staff or somebody, you might have somebody who can kind of crank out some example solutions really fast. I'm a little out of practice where I would do it, but
I would love to have an illustration of a small scale commercial use on potentially a residential property. So a garage, metal fabrication. I don't know what it would be, but I'm thinking of the ones I know in Heinsberg. We have a person who does blacksmithing on their property. He does amazing stuff. But yeah, some sort of commercial use. I don't know if Kirsten, you were thinking of a much larger scale commercial use.
Maybe earth extraction could be, a subtopic.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You know better than I do
Yeah, I mean, I
from
think
your
you just kind of have
experience.
to look at the
what
array of things that trigger Act 250 and are we have we thought about all those iterations? Warren's got his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Warren.
Thanks, Kirsten. That's exactly what I was thinking. Is a lot of this makes sense to all of us when we're talking about housing subdivisions, but when we talk about different types of commercial development, obviously the same opportunities to cluster or design things is not necessarily going to be as applicable. I hadn't even thought of extraction resources. Usually the resources being extracted because it's located where it's located, if you're talking about minerals or something, something to that extent. And we'll talk more about, we started talking a little bit with A&R about about ski areas and sort of interior trails and so forth. But obviously, if you're doing townhouses or residential development, these pictures and models are super helpful.
Yeah, maybe folks could chew on that a little bit between now and the new year, our next meeting. Yeah, that's a good one.
And that's got our hand up.
Go ahead, Annette.
Yeah, I was going to bring up quarries and extraction under the mitigation discussion. I use as an example the mine that was proposed a mile from my house, and I just confirmed on the map that the entire 600 and some acres is mapped as by Vermont Conservation designed for habitat connectivity. So the idea of avoiding or minimizing doesn't really seem possible, but it is an activity that would go through Act 250. And I like the questions you have about that we haven't gotten to yet about what happens with mitigation.
Yeah, it's a good point. It seems like in some of those extraction industries, due to the nature of it, mitigation may be the only option. Anyways, we'll get to that. Actually, why don't we get to that now? Our next item was to talk about mitigation, and Kirsten was able to dig up an example of one from the world of agricultural soils. That was in your packet. There's a plan in there, and then there's portion of a decision that was highlighted with some relevant passages about the mitigation. Kirsten, I would love to turn this over to you. I'm happy to share a screen if you want me to walk through the document.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do this. This was also just to kind of spark some thinking and ideas around mitigation and to show everyone how 9B works and has worked on some actual applications. So the first thing that Alex will show you is So this was a project that can remain nameless. But this was a proposal for a traditional residential subdivision that did not meet the, call it clustering component of Act 250 Criterion 9B, which is primary agricultural soils. And so the commission denied this on that basis. And then if you scroll down, and this was 27 lots, if you scroll down to the next, so what you're looking at as a revised project design, which was a reduction in lots, and I think it's a very similar lot size, but I didn't do an analysis of lot size. But you can see the green areas retained open space, and there was a sledding hill, and this revised design encompassed that common space element that was just referred to, and met Act 250 Criterion 9B and was approved as a reconsidered design. So this was just, I was trying to find something a little bit analogous within the actual like Act 250 files, a little bit analogous to some of the illustrations that Alex showed more generally about, you know, habitat and conservation subdivision outside of Act 250. And this was just, you know, one thing that I anecdotally, you know, knew of and could readily identify that was within Act 250 and wasn't something that was sort of originated maybe at a local level with some design iterations as sometimes would occur. So if you scroll down in the next part, this is actual excerpts from a decision, you know, not too long ago. This is the Criterion 9B language that considers whether or not a project will have an undue adverse effect and prescribes that these sub-criteria have to be met when ag soils are implicated. And it's all based on mapping. So it's very similar to what we're considering for 8C, and that it's, you know, you look at the map. Does the project, you know, directly impact 9B soils? And if so, you have to go through these sub-criteria, which consider interference with ag or forestry on adjoining lands, that there aren't other lands owned that can support the project, and that it's been planned or minimized to, you know, result in, you know, compact development, and that the remaining prime ag soils would support continued commercial agriculture, and that suitable mitigation is provided. So that's the language in the statute. And if you scroll down, and I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly, and this excerpt from an Act 250 permit decision does not correspond to the illustration of the, you know, the traditional versus revised subdivision example. It's just a different random, you know, Act 250 looks at Criterion 9B a fair bit, and it's very prescriptive, and practitioners know how to apply it. And what you're seeing in front of you is just one of many examples of how this criteria is analyzed and works. So in this case, for which you'll see some highlighted text, and I don't have the map corresponding to this one, but it's just to walk you through quickly. There were 25 acres mapped on the property, and there was like a table of the specific soil units that meet the requirements for Act 250 Criterion 9B. Some of them were previously disturbed, so they were no longer considered 9B soils. So of the 25, there were 3.5 that had been previously disturbed. And there was consideration of presence of wetlands, et cetera. The applicant consulted the Agency of Agriculture, who identified that one must have at least 2 acres of contiguous soils to could be considered to meet the requirements for on-site mitigation. And if you keep going down, there had been a case cited whereby some acreage was offered for on-site mitigation that was narrow. And one of the reasons I pulled out this example is because it did get to this level of specificity with respect to shape and width. And in the case that was referred to, there was a proposal to recognize that some strips of land that were in the order of 100 plus feet wide be designated for on-site mitigation, and that those were too narrow to meet the requirements for on-site mitigation. And so in the decision that I'm referencing here, the commission found that what was provided for on-site mitigation was not narrow, was not in the order of 100 plus feet, and was also 2 acres, and so therefore was eligible to be used for on-site mitigation to offset the impacts to soils that the project created. So keep going down. Yeah, some of the the analysis considers whether or not there's any barriers that reduce accessibility to the soils. So I just kind of wanted to footnote that. You can just keep going. And basically, the end here shows this calculated mitigation formula that's used, and it's based on the rating of the soils. There's this thing called the important farmland rating, which is a numeric value of 1 to 10, and 1 to 7 are ag soils. And if you're in the highest, best soils, like number 1, 2, 3, those are the most prime. And the mitigation ratio starts at, for every 1 acre you impact, you have to designate 3 acres that's protected from development. And if you're at the lower end of the range of value of, say, a number 7, which I think from memory is the highest, or is, yeah, it's 1 to 7 that are prime ag soils. So 7 is the lowest ranked soil. And the mitigation ratio for that particular type of soil is 1 to 2. For every 1 acre you impact, you set aside 2. And there's some other factors if you're in an industrial park, et cetera. But so this shows this calculation of, hey, the project is impacting 2.3 acres, and based on that soil, rating, the mitigation ratio applied here is 2.25, and the applicant designated 6.3 acres of on-site mitigation. And this is sort of more, it's very wordy. Some of this is like, Act 250 attorneys, and it's a very just detailed analysis of each of the sub-criteria. And ultimately, this project met the requirements for Act 259B on that basis.
But it involved both on-site and
I think this one,
for
no, I
off-site,
think this
or
one
was
was, I actually think this one was all on site. If you scroll down, I think we would have that. Yeah, so this particular one was all on site.
Okay.
But people can do, they can ask for circumstances that would, they can ask the commission to recognize that there are circumstances that would make the project and the property eligible for off-site mitigation. And in some cases, they can do a combination of the two. You might have enough land on site that you want to designate to meet a portion of a mitigation requirement. But if there's not enough, you could also supplement that with some offsite mitigation. And there's a whole established system of payment into a fund that, and most of you probably know this, that's used to procure farm easements. And it's based on the market rate for the region that historically has been updated, annually, and ranges from, and I'm just going to throw out some numbers. I think the last update I've seen the Northeast Kingdom region was in the order of 1,700 an acre, whereas Chittenden County is more like 5,000 an acre. Like it's a much higher, rate depending on where the property is in the region and what the market is for that region.
But just to ground us all in terms of what on-site mitigation even means, it means, and if I can just encapsulate it, you've impacted a certain amount of important soils. And we've got a formula that says, if you agree to protect a certain amount of soils, the multiplier, this project was, you impacted 2 acres and now you've got to protect 6.3 acres. If you've got enough good ag soils on your property and agree to protect that 6.3 acres, that's what on-site mitigation is, right?
Right.
And the protection means you won't develop it, and in an agricultural soil sense, you'll keep it open for potential future agricultural use of some sort. You won't let trees grow up into it, right?
Yep. So if you elect to do on-site mitigation, there would be a standard set of conditions that from memory, again, I think call for mowing at least every 2 years, brush hogging, that it be available for farming. It doesn't require that it actually be in like farm use, but just that it be available for farming. It doesn't, and the program doesn't prescribe that people, actively market, this is available or what have you. It's just that it's basically undeveloped and kept from returning to a forest cover through brush hogging and mowing. And it would be mapped out on a site plan. So it would be, depicted, here's the footprint of the project, here's the extent of the development to that, well, let's start with, here's a piece of property, what subset of the property is comprised of these non-B soils, and then you overlay the footprint of the project onto that to determine how much is directly impacted. And then if you're doing on-site mitigation, you would have that, that designated on-site mitigation area shown to meet the acreage requirement, and that it would be specifically referred to in the permit with its accompanying set of conditions.
So what do people think about the 9B mitigation system to the extent you understand it from that summary, in terms of how it could be applied to an 8C mitigation strategy? And Ryan, sorry, who was first here? Billy, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for all the work providing this example. I think there's some kind of high level value in looking at 9B, but as we've discussed a number of times, it's really not relevant to these functions and values. It's talking about just basically an acre test and whether there's a presence of soil, and everything about forest blocks and connecting habitat are dealing with a function and value that's dynamic and place-based, and it's just it's not a good parallel. So I just would caution that we not spend too much time talking about 9B, because I don't think it's going to be a framework that will work. I think there's elements of it that could, but
that's the reason it was shared, Billy.
Yeah, and I think there are some examples of like Act 250 projects where this issue had previously been addressed under the RINA criteria that we can provide as examples of how kind of minimization and mitigation were addressed there. But it may be just easier for us to kind of come back at the next meeting with a more fleshed out proposal of how to kind of tackle this based on our decades of experience at the PUC and whatnot.
Yeah, we're just wanting, speaking as one board member, for people to make known if they have specific proposals for how they think mitigation should work.
Yeah, and I do think some of the general concepts are worth thinking about, on-site versus off-site.
Yeah.
For example, whether that tracks within the conversation about forest blocks and habitat connectors. And we talked last time, I think, about how it maybe does not track for certain habitat connectors. And the statute tells us we need to identify circumstances when mitigation in general just doesn't work, can't be accomplished. And habitat connectors are the good example of that. But with regard to forest blocks, yeah, I wonder about on-site versus off-site. Ryan, you had your hand up? You had your hand up?
Yeah, just, I guess my initial thought was, really trying to think about ways to disincentivize offsite mitigation. I think Billy mentioned in his comment how place-based a lot of this stuff is, and I think that's important. I might have missed this in the example you gave, but is the ratio of mitigation land to impacted land on that prime ag soil example the same for on-site mitigation as it is for offsite, or or those ratios change at all?
Yeah, they're the same.
Any other thoughts about mitigation and what form it might take in a Criterion 8C framework? The question I put on the agenda was, should mitigation be encouraged in the form of conservation easements? Annette, go ahead.
Yeah, I struggle with this one. I mean, over the years, it's been pretty clear that mitigation for wildlife doesn't work. I can provide some somewhat entertaining examples, but the quarry property that I'm referring to would be a good one to discuss. If mitigation in the form of payment was allowed, who would receive that and manage the funds? And I mean, basically, you'd be looking at cutting a very large portion of a forest that's in a important habitat connectivity block, and it would be for an extraction project that would have a lot of impacts to the community. So should those funds go to the community? I agree that anything we can do to minimize the use of mitigation is the best approach. I just don't really know what to suggest as an alternative, because it's again a pay to play program where the amount of money that's gotten probably is not really going to do much for protecting a resource elsewhere. I don't know, as you can tell, I'm struggling with it a bit, but anything that we can do to promote avoiding and minimizing and discourage mitigation, I think would be in the best interest of the environment.
Thanks, Annette. Chris, thoughts on that or something else?
Yeah, I guess when we're talking mitigation, are we by default talking about payment in this rubric? And I'm sorry if that's a very simplistic question.
That's why I posed the question about conservation easements, and on-site versus off-site mitigation. On-site mitigation doesn't involve any exchange of money, right? It's just a designation of a certain area on the property and a pledge and a requirement that it be managed in a certain way. It's only off-site mitigation that involves, dollars going somewhere and then presumably being used to benefit that resource. And that's the case with 9B, right? Is those agricultural off-site mitigation funds go to the Vermont Housing Conservation Board that then uses them to help conserve farmland in other locations. So yeah, the money is just off-site, not on-site.
Well, I plugged into the chat what we did. This is a different context now, but in Maryland, in the county where I was deputy planning director, the critical area rules are far more prescriptive than anything I think we're talking about. But I plugged into the chat examples of basically what mitigation is required, but it also provides example mitigation plans. So not just perfectly transferable, but sharing that, because I think it's a similar context to what we're talking about. So happy. It's pretty easy to navigate. Just take a look.
Thanks, Chris. Trey,
Hey, thanks, Alex. I just wanted to, did want to confirm that what you're saying is how VHCB manages the mitigation funds that come to it. They come as a result of offsite mitigation, and the payments are factored by acre. And I don't want to weigh in on whether we should have offsite or not, but just say that the way we've managed it is generally to bundle funds, so it doesn't, we don't go out and conserve a farm immediately after there's been a project that results in mitigation. The funds do have to get bundled before there's a project. We generally try to do that in the district, where the initial impact was, but sometimes have used those funds outside of it. I also think that Billy is, I want to just agree with him that the kinds of analyses of what parcels would be good conservation matches were we to bundle, whether it was ANR or VHCB or somebody else who bundled payments and did it, it would be really hard to duplicate those. It's not as simple as the soils maps that we work with to do this under 9B. But interested to continue the conversation.
Yeah. Other thoughts, Jamie?
Through Act 250, is there a mechanism, so like on site, if you're trying to achieve conservation, and you had asked like whether an easement should be required, can you through the Act 250 permitting process create sort of an enforceable prohibition against development, or do you really need to look towards the easement as the mechanism to do that?
I'm gonna look at the one with experience with Act 250.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically what I was just describing as far as if you had an on-site mitigation 9B area, for example, it would be governed by a set of specific enforceable permit conditions that would say not developed, you got to mow it at least every 2 years.
So I can envision the same with forests. You've designated a certain area of on-site mitigation as forest. It can't be developed. It needs to remain in forest cover in whatever succession is appropriate, and perhaps there's a requirement that there be an up-to-date forest management plan for that area. Maybe that's enough. Maybe a formal conservation easement is needed, but that would make it a lot more complicated.
Right. I mean, I do see the utility for on-site sort of being able to rely on that as long as it's enforceable and understanding on 9B works. I was just curious if that's over time has withstood, I guess, any scrutiny that it's, didn't know if people try and get out of that like they do local permitting requirements. At times you can, sort of suggest that there's changed circumstances. So anyway, I was trying to sort of get at that.
Yeah, I mean, people can come back in and demonstrate that circumstances and facts have changed to support that they revisit these restrictions that are in effect through Act 250. Or for instance, they might come in and say, well, we've got this mitigation area designated. Now we want to do it over here. That kind of thing. But it would be looked at on a case-by-case basis by the commission as part of a formal application to modify that restriction. And there would have to be circumstances that would justify that could occur, that it could be revisited.
Okay.
And that's all part of what the commission would review.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just going to mention quickly, just kind of, this is a little random, but I was looking through, Billy, the 2023 bear habitat mitigation guidelines that ANR has. And I was noticing that there's, I think from memory, a 1 to 10 mitigation ratio if the land designated has 10% forest management in effect, and there's a 1 to 4 mitigation ratio if the land designated has 30% forest management, something of that in that order. So it, like, the mitigation requirement is in part a function of the specifics of how that designated land is managed. So.
Yeah, my sense is that, and Bob can correct me, but I don't think this would need to get at that level of detail. It's mainly around maintaining forested and natural cover, and forest management is consistent with those objectives, as is passive management. So I don't know that it would have to be that complicated.
Yeah.
But thank you. Yeah,
I'm
we
just
we
noticing
yeah,
that.
yeah, there's that. There's the deer yard. We have a number of different kind of habitat specific guidance documents that contemplate mitigation, and I think we could draw from all those, and then kind of the work we've done in 250 around rhinos, and then 248 regarding regional connectivity, to kind of put forward a proposal that might be workable here for folks to consider.
And sorry, just one other thought. Um, I could see where in the statute it was contemplated, and to Annette's point, I recall there was a pretty vigorous debate as to whether mitigation should be allowed or not, and in the end, it's there, but my understanding is it's the last step. Like, first show you can avoid, if not show you can minimize, and then as a last resort, and LURB has to determine where it wouldn't be appropriate. In the areas where it may be appropriate to mitigate, I guess I could see for offsite, like maybe there's a contemplation. It's really important to do on-site mitigation based on sensitive, maybe because you're in a high priority forest block, and that would be the first preference there. If somebody comes in under sort of scenario 4 here, where there's a rebuttable presumption and it's determined there's an undue adverse effect and it can't be minimized, maybe in certain circumstances there, you do have an offsite mitigation fund or bank through VHCB. And in that case, it would be appropriate. And I guess the question, would be what's the ratio? So I don't know, in my mind, maybe I'm thinking like, what's the sensitivity or prioritization of the resource that could drive, where that offsite would be appropriate versus more of an on-site requirement. But I could see probably in both scenarios, even if you're not in a high priority block, at times you may want to resort to on-site.
Chris, you're up.
Yeah, I'm not trying to open up a can of worms, but one of the things that I maybe trauma, my trauma from Maryland, but we spent so much time in our zoning enforcement and permit enforcement division, making sure that people actually follow the mitigation plans and did everything that they were supposed to do. It just occurred to me that I'm not sure exactly what the rubric. I'm not really clear on what the current rubric is in Vermont, but just a heads up on that, because when you start getting into these, like especially if we're talking about what could be smaller parcels, as opposed to like a big resort development or something, and keeping an eye on those. And part of this also tied into, if you look at the mitigation requirements, we actually had bonding requirements around mitigation in Maryland. And so there was a lot of like monitoring related to the actual release of those bonds. Just want to put that out there. We don't have to do anything with that. I just wanted to throw that out just from my practical experience with mitigation sometimes.
Gotcha. You want to strike fear in the hearts of all of us with what it takes to administer these things going forward. Duly noted.
That was just a small question I had. Is there any mechanism to look at mitigation by permit condition, sort of beyond the individual permit scale? Like, is there a structure that the board has to aggregate that information?
Master planning.
Like to share permit obligations between properties, basically.
I guess I'm just
So,
thinking, like if you're looking, some of these designs, like looking at that multiple parcels where the different open space ends up, like is there a framework to be able to look at that? If one parcel has permit conditions here and another one here, like, is there any ability to aggregate that spatially?
Within Act 250, if it's all under the same ownership, yes. Like if it's all part of the applicant's, land for which they're coming in with a project, sure. But if it's, some unaffiliated person or entity's land, we don't have a system to do that.
Okay, that's what I was thinking of, like across the whole forest block, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that comes to mind has to do with Act 145, traffic mitigation, whereby if an applicant funds a project that creates traffic capacity for a future developer, that the commission has currently a process and a formula where they can include, a permit obligation, for the later development permit, to have them reimburse the first developer for having paid the corresponding cost to create capacity that supports the second developer's project. So it's kind of, pay that guy. But it hasn't been used much, but it is there.
And that's, Kirsten's experiences with this program, so best experience there. Mine is with municipal development review, and so less relevant, but very similar. That oftentimes the review is very much focused on the property that that person owns and not a whole lot else. And it is, again, transportation issues that tend to be the things that get looked at beyond the boundaries where you have intersecting roads and the like. So I think that I have a desire to have this criterion look beyond the parcel boundaries, for exactly the reason that slide indicated and you were bringing up, Bob, that, it's the context of the habitat connector and the forest block matters. And frankly, most of these forest blocks are way bigger than any individual parcel that are going to come under Act 250 review. So, yeah, you'll see that when we go through the exercise after the break. Any other thoughts before we break for a few minutes? It's been a couple hours, so I assume people need to use the restroom and take a stretch. Peter?
Just, yeah, quickly. I mean, if you did on-site mitigation in a forest block, what is that? I mean, how do you mitigate on-site?
Yeah, I think the simplest example in my mind is you've impacted 5 acres of highest priority forest block. We're going to use a multiplier that says you now need to mitigate double that, 2x, right? So that means somewhere else on your parcel, you need to identify 10 acres of forest that you will commit to not developing, to managing as a forest, and potentially having a management plan that's, reviewed by the county forester or whatever. And that 10 acres is your on-site mitigation.
And in some cases, you would also like replant, right? So let's say you've got pasture that's no longer being used as pasture. You would replant, right, with a new buffer with trees, and if you look at if you I can share it later on with everybody, but like if you look at like what we did in Calvert County, that's part of what you would do if you had to clear some area, you could mitigate on site by planting native trees. We had a whole list of things that you could use to get certain credits for what you plant, and then you also have to mitigate against or prevent manage for invasives. But that's an example, another thing that you could do on site. So it's not like let's say you don't have the existing forest, you're basically committing to planting new forest.
Yeah, although Chris, I would push back a little bit. I think in the Vermont context, that'll be the exception by far. There's so much forest here that I think if we're going to have on-site mitigation, it's mostly going to be protection of existing forest on the site. But sure, I suppose we could include planting.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that's another that could fit into it too, depending on. I mean, in the event that'd be the nature of the beast. But anyway, I was just throwing that out as another example.
Yeah.
Of on-site mitigation. That's all.
And so Peter, I think the difference, the way I'm thinking about it, is that if a project does substantial avoidance and minimization such that no mitigation is required, which is what we want, then we don't have to be in the business of having permit conditions on the rest of their forest, right? They can do whatever they want with it. And if it triggers the need for another permit in the future, they come back. But otherwise, it's unencumbered. But if that same project can't do the appropriate amount of avoidance and minimization and has to do some mitigation, then it's like, they're dedicating a certain area that's not to be developed and will be managed properly. And then it's going to be a permit condition and somebody's going to have to pay attention to that.
As opposed to just avoid or minimizing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Gotcha. It would be additional to minimizing for
Right.
that particular part. Okay.
Okay. Let's take a break. We will reconvene at 3:15. All right, those of you online, if you're out there and you're hearing my words,
We're back.
we are about ready to reconvene. It's 3:14, so you have less than 60 seconds to return to your screen. Welcome back, Billy. We're just waiting for the rest of the online crew to return. It's dangerous to have a break in a long meeting and, late afternoon. It's very tempting to just walk away from
Head
that.
right out the door.
Yeah. Our group here in the room was chatting about skiing, so there's all sorts of enthusiasm and anticipation here about what's waiting for us.
I may or may not have gone for an hour this morning, and if I did, it was very good.
I'm back. I was moving hay and replacing my chicken's waters for the third time.
Well, that's a different kind of skiing, and that's yeah.
Billy, do you still ski at Stowe?
I do, yeah. It's been snowing here all day.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the snow coming down again. 3:16. We'll give folks another minute, and then I'm just going to launch into it, because what I want to do is get through one or two examples, exercises of sorts, and then talk about next steps, and still get out of here by 4. All right, let's just dive back in, and those that are not here yet can catch up when they get here. So thanks for the conversation so far. We've got about 45 minutes left, and I want to save about 10 or 15 at the very end for sort of next steps and parting comments. So the next time on the agenda is to work through a hypothetical example. Folks mentioned at the last meeting it would be interesting to do that, and so I have 2. Hopefully we can get through both of them. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through them. Hold on just a moment. Okay, so you're looking at the state of Vermont with a little bit of blue in there. That's not ice, that's water. This is a summer picture, of course. So I'm going to show you what the highest priority blocks look like across the state first, before we zoom into a particular place and work through what a Criterion 8C review might look like. So in orange, as it's slowly coming up, are the highest priority connectivity blocks. So this is from Vermont Conservation Design. These are forest blocks that are the most important ones to make sure that critters and plants are able to move across the landscape as things change, climate, development, what have you. In purple, coming up now, are the highest priority geological diversity blocks. This is the one that I have the hardest time explaining, and if anybody needs an explanation, I'm gonna make Bob do it. But these are another area of highest priority forest blocks that are representative of within particular biophysical regions. And then finally, the third piece of Vermont conservation design in terms of forest blocks are the interior forests. And so in green, you're seeing the highest priority interior forest blocks. And as you can tell from the way this is displayed, many blocks serve more than one function. And so these are sort of 3 dimensions of a forest block, and one forest block could be a highest priority in multiple dimensions. So with that said, I'm going to turn these blocks off for just a moment. And I'm going to zoom into the place that you probably could guess I would zoom into. All my examples come from Heinsberg. That's where I spent a lot of years. So let me zoom in there just for a moment. So rubric here. So here's Heinsberg. I'll turn the roads on. So for anybody who's familiar with the place, you can get a better sense of where things are. That big blue blob up there is Lake Iroquois. It's the largest lake. This is Shelburne Pond to the north outside of Heinsberg. We're going to look at one particular parcel that's down here in the southwestern portion of town. But first, I'm going to turn these blocks back on so we can zoom in to the block in question. So this large block here on the south side of town is both an interior forest highest priority block. It is also a highest priority connectivity block. And it's also a geological diversity highest priority block in purple. So I'm going to show you that block again. We'll zoom into that. This is a block of about 2,000 acres. And as you can see, it's all one block. This, if I click on it to select it, that's the entire block. So it's a little squirrely. It's not just one cohesive polygon. It's a bunch of connected polygons that go through hedgerows like Charlie was talking about. And the area in question, the parcel in question that we'll work through right now is this one outlined in yellow. This property is off of Isham Road in Heinsberg. And this is the Lewis Creek that passes through a good chunk of it. I'm going to turn off the block for a moment and turn on the aerial photos so you can get a better sense of what's going on here. So again, Isham Road is here to the north. This is Lewis Creek coming through the property. I'll zoom into the property itself. In addition to Lewis Creek, there's a tributary that feeds into it that crosses the property here, and another one up in the northwest corner here. I'll give you a sense for a little bit more of the natural features on the property. There is a large flood hazard area that surrounds the Lewis Creek, and an associated river corridor area that's in sort of blue, largely overlapping with the flood hazard area, not entirely, but close. Additionally, there's topography. This is Vermont after all. And so here are the slopes in gray of 25% or greater, the steepest slopes on the property. So you can see that around that stream, which looks like it's not properly mapped, there are some steep slopes, and there's some more of an unmapped drainage area up in here. So if we were to think about a development proposal here, it's clear that where the development would be proposed would be closer to Isham Road on the north side of the property, and likely in this northeast corner, right? Away from the flood hazard area, away from the steepest slopes, closer to the road access. So I'm going to zoom into that northeast corner of the property. And you can see the adjacent house, which is currently the last house on the road. Sorry, I should have backed up for just a moment. This property is about 57 acres, to give you some scale. It's actually owned by Fish and Wildlife. It's owned by the state. So this is not a property that's going to get developed anytime soon. But I thought it was an interesting example to run through. If we just pretend that it was, Alex's property and I wanted to put some houses on here. So I'll zoom back into that northeast corner. And again, you can see, it's a little hard to see the black line, but Isham Road is this linear feature at the top. Here's the last house on the road. So we would be continuing on to put some development in here. Let me show you the first scenario. Real simple. This is an undeveloped lot. What if I want to create a new building lot on it? There's a building lot in white. It's about an acre in size. How about I site a home on it, maybe somewhat similarly separated from the road as this existing home. And let's put in a driveway to serve it. So there's the development proposal that's in front of you. Let's assume that this property is subject to Act 250 because it's part of a prior Act 250 permit. Perhaps this lot was divided off from several others. It's not that one creation of one lot and one house would trigger Act 250, but if it's already subject to a permit, it would be in review, and therefore this development would require a permit amendment and Criterion 8C would be in place. So if I go back to the forest block, there it is in green. And you can see that this proposed lot and house site is at the edge of it. We're about 200 feet off the road, but because the forest block does not include this buffered area around the existing home to the west, we're only about 50 feet or so, maybe less, off of the edge of the forest block, but we're clearly in it. So I don't have a whole lot more to say about this except to show you, here's an example of a very small scale development of a house that's clearly in the forest block, is at the edge of it, represents new development. If we walk through the stepwise process that was in the A&R draft, the first step would be, are we impacting a forest block? I think the easy answer to that is yes, we're in one. And, then the next step is whether we're having an adverse impact and whether that impact is undue. What do you think about this example? What thoughts come to mind looking at this in terms of whether there's an adverse impact, whether that would be undue? That's as much coaching as I'm going to give you. Sorry.
No.
Was that a no from someone? There's no impact?
Yeah, sorry, that was Charlie. I would offer no, there's no undue adverse impact.
Why do you say that, Charlie? What drives that?
I mean, without knowing about any more kind of finite features out there that would be addressed in step 4, it's occurring relatively close to the edge of the forest block. The access is predominantly outside of the forest block. I mean, to me, this looks like if we were going to have somebody build a home on this parcel, this is exactly what we want to see.
There's the overall parcel, just so you can again get a sense of the scale of the 57 acres with the 1 acre building site. Yeah, go ahead, Kirsten.
So Charlie or others, so if this is not an undue impact, which as one board member I would tend to agree with, do you think that the project review should encompass memorializing that this has had some impact, that, you know, so that one could consider cumulative impacts at some later point in time. That is what occurs with the 9D review. If there's you know, what one would call a de minimis impact that doesn't reach the threshold of requiring mitigation, it's kept track of. So it's just kind of like something to think about.
And remember, this is a project that's in Act 250, right? A permit is required, so there will be a tracking mechanism through the issuance of the permit.
Yeah. So you know, there could be a finding made. It's not an undue adverse impact, but it does, you know, have a penetration of the forest of 250, whatever number of feet. But
So just
just
to be
think about
clear, are you offering that it would be kind of like the same framework as the road rule, where the impact is cumulatively measured over time?
That's
So
a
you're
good
saying that
question.
like,
Yeah.
so if they came back later and wanted to put a second house 1,000 feet back from that one out in the woods, the current dwelling would be considered in the same context as the new development. It wouldn't just be the new development that we're considering, it's the cumulative impact of all the development.
It's just a question. It's just a
it makes
question for the
sense.
group. Like, do people think that should be the framework, that it should be, yeah, so that all of the impact would be accounted for?
Let's go to Chris and then Annette.
So I guess my answer to the question you just posed, is I think you kind of have to, but I could be wrong. The other question I have, like looking at this example, is this the last one in? Like, I know you said hypothetically, right? Right. There's for whatever reason, it's an Act 250. I guess I'm trying to think, okay, so out of that larger yellow framed area, is this going to be the last one in? Is this the beginning of others? You know, so it feels like there has to be some kind of registered documentation of impact on whatever the larger project area is going to be. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I get you, Chris, and this is not the last one in because I'm about to turn on the next phase, but yeah, I understand. Annette, what do you have to say?
So I'd say yes, I agree with Charlie that this first one would not be an undue adverse impact, but then my thoughts were, okay, what's next? So
Yeah.
what about filling up the whole space, the whole green space?
Yeah.
And at what
Yeah.
point does it become an undue adverse impact, and how? And so yes, to Kirsten's suggestion that yes, it should be included in and memorialized.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let me turn on a little bit more. Because that was my first thought too when I first mapped this. I wasn't actually trying to map it this way, but once I did, I thought, I don't think that this project would need to go through a minimization rubric. I think perhaps this is a de minimis impact that simply short circuits the criteria right at the front end. Like, there is an impact, but it's not undue. You don't have to meet minimization strategies because you kind of already did. That was just my initial thought. So, okay, next phase. Let's fill it up. So, in Heinsberg, for what it's worth, the zoning would allow for 4 building sites on this lot. So let's do that. There's 4. This is a development plan. Sorry, I'm going to turn the block off so you can understand why they're arranged the way they are. That factors in where the steepest slopes are. And the fact that it's not likely that in this particular parcel, somebody's going to punch a road to get down to the edge of the floodplain. It's more likely they're going to want to stay on high ground and avoid, the steepest slopes. So in any case, here's that initial lot, and here are 3 more lots with a road and driveways off of them. What does this look like to you? Is this no longer a de minimis impact? Is this an undue adverse impact that needs to be minimized? And if so, did the project do it? Thoughts?
I'd say yes to adverse impact. I mean, it's getting right into the forest block. Have they minimized? You know, I mean, it's hard to tell, I guess.
Yeah, I'll turn the purple off so we can stop staring at the flood hazard area and just look at the block. There's, it's in green. And again, I think context matters, so I'll just zoom out a little bit so you can see again where the overall block is going.
And just a clarifying question, is this assumed to be a connector or not a connector?
It is a connector, yep.
Okay.
Right now, I want to keep us focused on the forest block side of the equation, but we can talk about the habitat connector side of it too, because in this case, it's both.
Yeah, when you just zoomed out, then my alarms went off on that connector thing.
Any other insights or observations, Jamie?
I wouldn't consider this an undue adverse impact, because I think, the floodplain was important. That was helpful context. But that's a clustered, relatively clustered design. And I think that's ultimately what we'd like to see. I mean, I guess at some point, if it expanded more, or, it may trip over into, some undue level, but.
So the idea being that, as Peter said, there's clearly an adverse impact because a bunch of the forest is being removed, a bunch of the block. But your point is, like, if we had the right minimization strategy in the rule, this design would meet it and be able to pass the test without having to do mitigation.
Is it a percentage of the total acreage? That doesn't seem.
Well,
right.
so that's part of the good question, right? This is a 2,000 acre block. Then if I zoom out, my mouse comes back to me, extends quite some distance away from the parcel in question. This is the block. We're talking about this portion of the block. And if you were to assume at least a half an acre of impact on each of these 4 lots, you're looking at least 4 acres of forest block impact. I don't know whether running metrics on percentage of the block matters, but maybe others have ideas on that front. About 50 acres of the parcel is mapped as a forest block. So it's about a 57 acre parcel, and most of it is in the forest block. Kirsten?
Well, we've got some people online, but I was just going to comment, like, one of my observations is that the area proposed for development does not disrupt, or doesn't appear to disrupt, connectivity with the core forest block corridor as it extends onto the properties to the east and west. So it doesn't, the placement within the 1,000 acre tract is an important component of the impact.
Gotcha.
Is that, if the scientists think that's true?
Go ahead, Chris, and then we'll go to Annette.
Yeah, and I'll just say where I struggle mentally with this is I keep trying to think of it like almost within a zoning context, not an Act 250 context. I'm like, so what else is applying on this? What are the other, what else is going to be considered in the site plan? But I would say no undue adverse impact. But then, the challenge for me is, right, we're under this rubric, as I understand it. Ultimately, we're going to have to take into account what's beyond that yellow square. And that's and so I'm curious to see how we handle this when that habitat connector comes into it. I'm not trying to complicate it. I'm just saying I'm trying to get my head around all the different factors we have to take into account here.
Yep, very good. Annette?
So I think this is where it gets into the limitations of mapping. What is the forest there? Is it a mature forest? Is it full of invasives? Does it matter? What sort of species are there? I think that this is where, okay, if jurisdiction is triggered, then the process needs to be played out. I don't know how much we can script this to the the rule that we're talking about, but I'd like to hear what the scientists, the ecologists have to say, because I would think that you would need to do some on the ground work to further evaluate the adverse or undue adverse impact.
Okay, well, that would definitely make it more involved. Warren?
Yeah, I agree with what Kirsten said earlier about looking at this in the larger context of that block. But also, not to put Bob on the spot, but I'd love to know what Bob, similar to what Annette just said, I'd love to know what Bob thinks about this, because ultimately we can have pictures about what a clustered subdivision looks like, but it doesn't take very long for you, as you just did, put a scenario on the table that we're all sort of not exactly, maybe some of us are sure, but I don't think this is an undue adverse impact. But I'd really like to hear what Bob's analysis would be, or try and walk us through it.
Do you want to speak to that, Bob?
Sorry, Bob.
I got another example to
Thanks.
do, and we got 2 minutes to do it, so
Well,
maybe be quick, and then we'll just give you your eyeball something else to see.
Okay. I mean, in some ways, I think the question is a little tough, because we're not really saying, is this like a desirable outcome? We're saying, is this unduly adverse right now? And we don't have anything to hang that on other than our judgment. And the whole point of doing these rules is so that we can hang undue adverse on something that's more concrete than just judgment. But as we're seeing here, the actual, like if we were just to apply a set of acreage ratios or distances or some other fixed metrics to this, the analysis can be kind of wonky, because there might be cases where you might want to go in further in one direction to avoid a whole bunch of other stuff, or clustering in this way is actually better than just applying a cookie cutter to it. And so when I look at this, I think of everything that, like what people are saying makes sense. This seems like a pretty clustered minimal impact to this forest block and right for the context. So how do we actually then put that into enough metrics to actually have something concrete to hang undue on, but not so strict that we can't actually do this sort of site-specific flexibility?
And per Annette's point, what do you think? Do you think there's an importance or a need to like, once the development proposal is put forward, to actually have an ecological assessment of the forest and what's being impacted? Or do you feel like that we can operate without that site-specific knowledge?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we have other criteria. We have rare and irreplaceable natural areas, and we have the wildlife habitat and the rare species, streams, all these other factors of natural resources that we can look at. So there's a bunch of things that we get picked up in other ways. So we don't have to worry about, like, is this deer wintering area? Is it mass stand? Is it natural community of statewide significance? So mostly we're talking about forest condition, which Annette mentioned. And I mean, I agree. Like, if I had to choose, I'd prefer to see development in an area that was scrappy, full of invasives, than in nice, mature, well-functioning forest. Do we spend a lot of time worrying about that micro difference right now? I mean, it's important, but I think in the scheme of what we're trying to do right now, that's like a very particular consideration, and it could like totally sidetrack us from this bigger picture.
Yeah, I'd appreciate if folks would think about that between now and the next time, because my vision for this was way more rudimentary than the complexity that Annette was pointing out, which is real on the ground. So if folks, just think about it, and like you said last time, or sorry, Annette, in another context, you said we should ping more of the ecologists too. Charlie, go ahead, and then I want to show a second example real quick before we wrap.
Yeah, just real quickly, one thing that jumps out to me looking at this is that with the development located where it is, it looks to me almost like it would be impossible or near impossible to actively manage the remainder of the parcel given access limitations. And maybe that might not be entirely true, but it just raises in my head, the question of, it's not just clustering the development, it's where you cluster it. And if you cluster it in a way that makes it impossible to provide access for forest management in the future, that to me is a big issue. So just want to add that to the mix.
That's a great point, Charlie. Thank you for adding that. And I don't think development precludes that. Maybe not even this development, depending on how the rights of way work and who owns the remaining land and to what extent the development road can be utilized for forest management as infrequently as that is. But it's a really good point. Okay, I'm going to stop that share and we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to show you another example, but very quickly. And I can, make some of this available offline for folks to be able to look at or play with to some degree. So, okay, we're back at the state of Vermont again, and we're going to zoom into a different parcel once again in Heinsberg. Sorry for the focus on that one place in Vermont. So there's Heinsberg. And once again, this is a larger parcel on the west side of town. I'll show you the blocks one more time. The only block that matters here are the geological blocks. So if I were to put on the connectivity blocks, we're back to that one we just looked at in orange, but that's not the area we're looking at now. If I put on the interior blocks, it's again just that block we looked at before, but we're not in that area. So we're just in this area in yellow, which is in the purple, the geological highest priority blocks. So if I zoom into that.
While you're zooming, I just want to mention that Jean asked a question in the chat when the prior example was up, asking about if the overall forest block was smaller, would the relative impact be more significant, leading to undue adverse impact? So she's kind of getting at the scope of impact or the size of the parcel or the tract.
Good comment, Jean.
Yeah.
My quick answer would be, yep, I think it would, but that's just me. So there's the property. Let me turn the aerial photo on. And I'll get rid of you can actually, before I turn off the block, the forest block, you can see why it's organized the way it is. This is an agricultural property that was conserved. So again, there's not going to be development on this. It's the old O'Neill farm, owned now by the Donegan family. And they farm, good half of the property. But just like a lot of farm properties, there's quite a lot of forest intermixed as well. And that's what you're seeing in purple as a highest priority forest block. So I turn that off, you can see where the woods are. And again, just like the other property, there's some significant constraints, just like there are on any property in Vermont. Here's the flood hazard area alongside the waterway. And I'll put the steep slopes on again so you can get a sense for where difficult terrain is in gray, a little hard to see there. But because we're focused on forested area and we're going to assume that the ag area is going to stay in ag, I'm going to focus on where is the most developable forest for this property. And what I haven't shown you very clearly are where the roads are. I'll bump this up to make it a little easier to see. So this black line right here is Leavenworth Road. You can see some house sites here. And this property has frontage on Leavenworth Road here by the La Platte River and also along these ag fields. But the forested portion has frontage here. It almost looks like there was a design to have some access here, maybe for forest management. So if we zoom into this area, which assuming this was a developable property, might be the most interesting for the property owner or for Alex, the developer. Here's the area in question. And I'll pop up some development. Imagine some home sites serviced by a road and driveways. and we'll just put some 1 acre lots around them. In Heinsberg, the minimum lot size in this zoning district is a half an acre, so you can actually get quite small lots. The number of lots is managed so as not to develop all the forest and fields, but the flexibility to have smaller lots is there. So these are about 1 acre. So again, this property is about, sorry, forgetting my script here. This is about a 250 acre property altogether. And the block size here, the highest priority geological diversity block is a smaller block of about 900 acres. So again, I'll zoom out so you can see the extent of that block. Again, it's a squirrely one. I'll click on it so you can see the extent of the block. But it incorporates all of this area. It's not just one cohesive, forest block. It's a larger area that includes everything you see outlined in red.
Okay, so the block is everything in red, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yes, so it's a large block. It's 900 acres, and it extends quite some distance away from this 250 acre property that we are looking at. So I'll zoom back into the area in question. And again, my question to you is, what do we think about this from a Criterion 8C standpoint in terms of, is there an adverse impact? Is it undue? Is it minimizing? What metrics would we need to be able to determine that it was minimizing, if it isn't at all?
What is a geological block, or how do you define that?
You're up, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Bob.
It's a terrible name for this idea that we wanted Vermont conservation design to represent forests in all the different type of landscapes we get in Vermont, not just the big undeveloped mountains and Northeast Kingdom. So if you just go by taking the biggest forest blocks or the most connected forest blocks, you don't actually end up representing the habitat needs of all of our plants and animals, because a lot of them are tied to the lower mid-elevation settings. There's a lot of biodiversity in places that have been more fragmented in the past. And so if we just focused on like the Green Mountains and the Northeast Kingdom, we wouldn't be protecting a lot of our biodiversity. And so geology has a direct correlation with biological diversity. And so by getting things like sandy soils, clay soils, calcium-rich bedrock, these geological features were enhancing the biological species representation.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So again, here's the corner of the property where this development project is proposed. We're going to say that this is a jurisdictional project from Act 250 standpoint. And then we want to ask the question, what do we think about it? And how do we think through it from a Criterion 8C standpoint? Again, the gray areas are the steepest slopes of more than 25%, which is why Alex, the developer, ran a 900-foot road through this area to get to what seemed to be, more workable land in here, and then plunked a bunch of houses.
So Chris Campany has his hand up unless someone likes.
Thanks, Kirsten. Chris, go ahead.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the impact, the area that we're judging whether or not the impact, the extent of the impact is the block as a whole, right?
Well, I think we're
that big red area that you were showing, earlier, right?
That is the block in question. Yes, this is the
Yeah, so I
development
would
within
say,
it.
so I would say no undue impact. It looks like it's being reasonably minimized. But you get a few more of those, the ones who are going to be the last one in, they're going to be they're going to be held to a higher standard. It feels like, not a higher standard, but they're going to be they're going to the extent you're chewing up that block over time. So I'm thinking just down the road, but this particular project itself, I don't think it's a undue impact.
Melinda?
Yeah, so I think where I'm kind of struggling is that I feel like this criterion is sort of in direct opposition to criterion, whatever the ag soils criterion, and that like I don't think this is the best choice to minimize impacts on forest on a forest block. I think from that perspective, a better choice would be to put the homes in the field, but then you're impacting ag soil.
Potentially.
Like up here in the north where there's road access and there's that big open field. I don't know. That's just.
Yeah, if the soils are mapped as 90 soils.
Yeah, it's a great,
Yeah,
it's a
it's
great
great.
observation. It's a great observation. Again, this property is not gonna get developed at all. But assuming it was developable and I was the developer and I just like to be in the woods, I suppose the first question of avoidance is, did you avoid as much of those forest block areas as you could have? Are there other places on the property that you could have developed that would not have impacted that forest block at all? And then, yeah, the question becomes, can you do that in the world of where ag soils are also a no-go zone, or at least a more difficult to go zone?
And again, Alex, you're not talking just the forested area in that yellow boundary site, right? You're talking the forest block as a whole. I think they
we're
can
talking
definitely.
both. I think we're talking both, Chris. And I think we're at a stage in this conversation where it's a little hard to know which one we should be spending more of our attention on. I want to keep us focused on the forest block. That's what the criterion is about. But at the same time, it's hard not to have a conversation about the portion of the forest block on the parcel. Yeah. Well, so these examples were just meant to get juices flowing and thoughts rolling. So anybody else have ideas about, the protocol for running through analysis on this proposed development or unintended consequences? Or
Jean has a comment in the chat about, she's saying that consequential impact has significant economic justice issues, especially for communities whose access to wealth has been intergenerationally delayed by past discriminatory policies and practices, flagging so that we can look at mitigation strategies.
Hate Manna, WANNER, and Jim Edgecombe.
okay.
Does that make sense? Just in terms of what Chris was saying about the last one in is going to be really squeezing it, and just when we understand that our communities have different access to wealth currently and different ability to kind of get to the front of those development lines, anything that's like building in terms of regulatory impact or the word that keeps coming to mind for me, which is a little bit silly, is like this kind of gold rush opportunity. Anyway,
and Jean, how do you? Yeah. So I think I understand what you're saying. Help me take that someplace. What do we do with that?
Yeah, sorry, caution, or like heads up, my toddler is screaming for me. So apologies, I'm gonna have to talk to her. But what we could do, for example, is kind of do some modeling of like, okay, what does that mean in terms of economic impact? And then how do we create some opportunities for the communities? I'm gonna say Black communities, for example, as a very good example of people whose intergenerational wealth has been impacted negatively and therefore have less opportunity to be at the front of the line for this kind of development, rural development opportunity. We could make investments alongside of the rollout of this law into the Black community that facilitated getting to the front of the line. Does that make sense? The front of the line for the opportunity.
Yeah, I think I'm taking it more along the lines of you don't necessarily want the first person in to be working in a forest block to suck up all of the capacity of that forest block to accommodate some development. You want the second, the third, the fourth to have some reasonable access to development. You don't want the first development to eliminate the potential for any further, understanding that those with the most resources are probably going to be the first at the table. I think you're also saying, is there a way to encourage disadvantaged communities to be able to get to the front of the table? But I'm not sure that this rulemaking, I'm not sure how to do that in this rulemaking. So we can think more about that.
I think just in general throughout this process and all of the rulemaking processes, that we need to establish as loudly and clearly, with like as close to in the rule or in the process for administering the rule, or even in the reporting that is coming out of the LURB right now around the rule, that we must take a step of doing an economic justice analysis of all of these rules and then figuring out strategies to mitigate that impact. That is a component that I feel, and I can speak on behalf of the LAOB here, for all of the rulemaking that is happening right now. We're really concerned that analysis is, that these rules are going to roll out without that analysis being done and without any mitigation strategies going into effect. And therefore, there's going to be kind of widespread people falling through the cracks. Broadly, I'm concerned about our rural lands becoming very, very gentrified. And you all are you're land use experts. It's hard for me to hang in this conversation, but in the weeds. But I'm concerned that we're not really looking at the broad scale here and what's going to happen to low income people in our rural communities.
Yeah, I hear you now. And trust me, at least with the tier 3 public engagement sessions we had, that was a very often cited concern that increased regulations will cost too much money, and it will be a pay-to-play system in which the wealthy can do whatever it is they want, and lower income Vermonters will be priced out. So I hear you. Okay, well, we're over time by just a little bit. Dory, I think you had your hand up at one point and put it down. Josh, go ahead, and then we'll try to wrap up.
Yeah, no, just sort of feeding off of Chris Campany's comment and what Gene had said. It's so ironic with this picture up here, because you look at that one house for one household occupying the same basic property acreage, and then the folks that are looking for a half an acre could be caught up. And so it just thinking of the dynamic of how much per acre impact to build a new housing development in a different way than one house is using 20 acres over on the right-hand corner. These other house developments are using 1 acre, and that how does that factor into this resource we want to protect and save, but yet we want to allow some of it to still help people that need to live in the rural parts of the state? And no answers there for you, just as I was looking at this picture and what Gene and how Chris' comment was put in there made me think about pointing that out.
Yeah, it's a great point, Josh. And the history of it is that though that house, the biggest one, was part of the overall conservation package of this family farm, that there would be some development in that location. And I don't want to make a judgment call, but I hear what you're saying, like that turned into one house on one very large lot. Could it have been more? Perhaps. But ultimately, the Act 250 program does not dictate how much development happens on a parcel. That's the decision of the landowner. And yeah, but I hear what you're saying. Okay.
Good one, thank you.
Yes, bye, Jamie. So yeah, I thank you and apologize for being over time. So very briefly, we tried to put another meeting on your calendar through email. January 9th is the date. So please hold that. We're going to work, Kirsten and I are going to work collaboratively with Billy and Bob to flesh out A&R's draft guidelines and try to take those to the next step using some of what we've heard today. And hopefully, if possible, bring it to you at that next meeting. Public engagement will follow But we really need to make sure the working group understands, where we're going with this before we try to bring it out to the community and explain it in a way that makes sense to somebody who's seeing it for the first time versus all of you who've had a chance at this, couple cracks at this at least.
Chris is
So-
asking what time on the night.
Right, good question. I don't know that we specified, but let's look it up, Chris. And well, let me put it this way. Chris, I will follow up, Kirsten and I will follow up with an email with that time so that you can book it in your calendar, not just the day. So look for a follow-up email on that. We'll get the recording of this meeting up on the website. We'll do a written summary after that and get that up as well. And as always, if you have follow-up conversation you'd like to have, Kirsten and I are at your disposal. Just contact either of us or both of us, and we're happy to set up a time and chat, and happy to take, questions by email or written comments as well. But we're still sort of in the formative stages, so don't feel like the train is passing you by. We'll talk more in January. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Alex.
Happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for the explanation.